I would like to thank you very much for joining us for our Lunch and Learn program today. My name is Emily Olin Squires, and I direct the Research, Education, and Outreach programs here at the Archive. I want to thank all these authors for showing up to talk to us today. I'm particularly pleased to bring you this topic because one of the things we really strive to do with this Lunch and Learn program is to share community history with one another. It is our belief that we all have a shared heritage, and it's very important for us to share those stories and the histories with one another. And we think the Archives plays a vital role in keeping and preserving those histories and allowing these stories to be told by finding the stories in the records and having wonderful authors such as these bring them out and publish them and share them with all of us. So I want to thank them very much for their time. I just have one quick announcement before we start. Our next Lunch and Learn program, February 13th, which is Wednesday, it is going to be by Janice Hayes Williams, and it's going to be about the Crownsville Hospital and the burial grounds that are on that property. So it's going to be a very interesting program. Please register with me to make sure you have a seat. Other than that, it's free, just like all of our Lunch and Learn programs. If anyone would like to provide support to such programming, please contact me about how you can get involved with the Friends of the Maryland State Archives, because they are our 501c3 support organization.
And what I will do is ask Pam Dunkett to do a very brief introduction of each of the panelists so we can get right to the presentations. And Pam?
Thank you. Thank you for coming. We're lined up in chapter order to make it easy. And we have Philip Allen, who's a retired dean from Frostburg University, Dean of Arts, and has published many a book, and has a foreign service background as well. And I was restricted to one sentence per person.
Okay. I do want to add that all of the authors reside in Arundel-on-the-Bay. Some grew up there and have long-term memories.
Right. Bill Semelik has written the chapter on our railway. He is an engineer. He's still working in the federal government. Karen Neal has done is an environmental consultant, is retired now, and is working on political activity and equal opportunity activity here in Anne Arundel County. Aris Allen, Aris T. Allen Jr., grew up in Arundel-on-the-Bay and provided a wonderful story of the 50s and 60s here. Edie Dolberg. Edie is new enough to the community that she said, "Oh, this sounds like fun. I'd like to help with the history." So she moved to us from Eastport. She's retired also from the federal contracting area. Mark Apter is a public relations consultant. He convened our group, and he has been all over the world in the projects that he's done, and has many talents. So we all got together. We have another author, Aaron Thomas, who's not here, and several of the people who've helped, and we've acknowledged them in the book.
Thank you very much, Pam. So without further ado, let's start with Philip and Chapter 1.
There we go. Forgive me for perching. I'd like to get a view of my victims. That's because I'm the recovering academic from this group, and that's why they gave me the first chapter, so I could start with the primeval ooze and bring you up to the date of the first settlement. It's a place that it was not settled until 1890, and so I don't have too many people to talk about. We have very little to report, although there is some information. And chapter 1 of the book tries as briskly as I could manage to get you through it. The place, that's all of the cast of characters that you, that most of whom you have met. Some of them aren't here, but that's us. And that's the organization of the book. What I'm trying to do is get you to there. We probably should have brought a more modern map. That's a Simon Martinet map of 1860, and we've lost considerable amount of that terrain, that earth that you see there. Some of you who've done some historical research will recognize some of these names. Some of the other names have simply vanished into historical obscurity. One name, the Duval property, which you see under the name Randall, and went westward to the South River, happens to be handed down from an original inhabitant, Marie Duval, who was a French Huguenot who settled here in 1862, and 1662, and begot an enormous clan, including some governors of Maryland, and ultimately Anne Burnham, whom you will recognize as the mother of the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama. So Barack Obama's family descends from this area, not Arundel-on-the-Bay, but within shouting distance of Arundel-on-the-Bay. So there's a kind of lineage that we regard as quite important. Also, the fact that this was, if anything, it was farmland. I'm going to try not to advance the slides. This, I did. Here we go. This is farmland, and the only evidence we have that it was used by people is some lore that descends from the Piscataway and Susquehanna Native Americans before the area was settled by colonists, and who probably never created a settlement in Arundel-on-the-Bay, but used it for hunting, fishing, perhaps grew crops. We don't know about that. We've had no archaeological evidence from Arundel-on-the-Bay. We have very little historical or genealogical evidence. Most of what we have, thanks to the archives, is our land grant, land transfers, deeds, and wills that show, obviously, from the colonists, from the colonial point of view, what happened to this area. It was claimed by the Piscataways before they were overrun by the Susquehannocks, and then eventually settled with the whole county, beginning in about 1649, settled from St. Mary's by people who couldn't take the slight deviations that St. Mary's colony was imposing on people, largely religiously, and moved into the Anne Arundel County area and traded land, grew tobacco. Probably they grew tobacco in Arundel-on-the-Bay, but we have no direct evidence of that. So most of what we know about the early history of Arundel-on-the-Bay itself, not the county but the bay, is by extrapolation from what was going on, much more detailed, documented, and intelligible in Annapolis and in the large estates. So the area we're talking about, Arundel-on-the-Bay, which has the name of Miss M. Chase, I'll get to that in a minute or two, and most of that area was farmland, probably settled seasonally by people as the Indian or Native Americans would enter and leave as the seasons dictated. So probably did the farmers who worked for the owners of the larger plantations in Arundel County and the area. So Arundel-on-the-Bay is a kind of passive witness to this coming and going of people, to the coming and going of shipping, including warfare on the Chesapeake Bay, but without any particular mark to be made upon that history. Nor did that history make that much of a mark on our community of Arundel-on-the-Bay, even when there were people planting, we assume, tobacco, certainly hunting geese and wild boar, bears, fox, fishing, and carrying on life, but in a kind of backwater to what was really happening in American history in Annapolis and in Anne Arundel County. So we have a fairly intelligible record of land transfers from one family to another. These are often major families. Sometimes they're families who vanish into obscurity as the peninsula witnesses what's going on in the rest of the world. We know that the population of Annapolis had to, the affluent population of Annapolis, the people who could afford to, would vacate the city quite frequently whenever any excitement was going on the Chesapeake. And that happened in the French and Indian Wars of the middle 17th century. It certainly happened during the Revolution as the British fleet blockaded Annapolis and sailed up and down the bay. It happened in the War of 1812 and in the Civil War. So you had this exodus. Nobody ever seems to have decided to come to Arundel-on-the-Bay, perhaps because it was too exposed to attack from the Chesapeake. There's one story that in 1813, as the British blockaded during the War of 1812, that a British man of war, a sloop of war, ran aground on the bay, on a shoal that was not lit yet by the Thomas Point light, but because there was no light for another 12 years until 1825, and that sloop ran aground, and before the British Navy could move from Kent Island down to rescue the sloop, there was an idea that the batteries that were set up to defend Annapolis could be moved over to Arundel-on-the-Bay and blow the sloop out of the water. Somebody thought better of that, because if the batteries were emptied of the only cannons they had, the British Navy at Kent Island could destroy Annapolis. So those of you who are Annapolitans can thank somebody for saving the city. Well, the final moment of, here we go, the bay, from the Arundel-on-the-Bay point of view, is the Thomas Point Lighthouse. This is the third lighthouse that was built to supervise traffic along the Chesapeake in this area. The first you saw was at the end of an island that in the previous slide in the map connected Thomas Point with Arundel-on-the-Bay. That has completely disappeared, and the lighthouse was built in 1825 and was collapsing by the late 30s, and so the lighthouse was moved to Thomas Point to the west for a while. That ground proved to be eroding as well, and when that lighthouse began to collapse, the British had already discovered the technology of the screw pile lighthouse. Started in England and was converted here to the needs of the Chesapeake Bay traffic in 1875. And that lighthouse, of course, can still be visited today. It's on the historic register.
Thank you, Philip.
My research was 1890 through 1920. It was a great project because there was no community memory. So I could dig at my own leisure. But what was fascinating in terms of archives is that I discovered, as you do, going through holdings of various institutions, that there were 4 boxes of Arundel-on-the-Bay materials at the Historical Society of Washington. And a gentleman who had been involved in Arundel-on-the-Bay from the 1890s to 1930s. When he died, his son contributed his records, and we had minute notebooks from 1890 through 1911, handwritten minutes of the organizers of the group that bought this land. The group was the Chesapeake and Columbia Investment Company. They were 7 Washington, D.C. businessmen, led by a lumber merchant, there was a doctor, a lawyer, several bankers. We have some rumor that they came down in the late 1880s to take a look around to where they could find a community. But it wasn't until 1890, when in September, when our originators, as they call themselves, bought 370 acres, which included our frontage here on the bay and Thomas Point Island and what is now Oyster Harbor. So that was our territory. And this is the plat of the map. This was almost one piece of land. We have lost probably 100 feet of our frontage. This is a street called Chesapeake Avenue, which was our frontage street, which is no longer there. It's gone. Primarily because of the hurricanes, particularly the one in 1933. But as you see, the original cottages were wood, and some of the gates were of natural sticks, so you got that kind of Adirondack look. This woman is Margaret Taylor Randolph. You might have, Randall, I'm sorry, she was a photographer in the 1890s, and so we have this wonderful shoreline. We were very lucky to find, in addition to the written record, that we found people who could give us information to that period. This woman we found, my colleague found her. Her name is Louise Seeley. This is when she was 2 in about 1915. And at the time, in addition to the persons who bought lots and built cottages, lots of people tent camped. And they came with the intention to tent camp. They rented tents from residents here. So this was a nice visualization of what we were like. We were very forested, and there was a boardwalk along this Chesapeake Avenue that has disappeared. You can see it in this shot. There was gas lighting, and it was turned on and off by a caretaker who was responsible for things all year round. So the group was governed by Thomas Smith, who was the mayor of Arundel-on-the-Bay until about 1919. He was the lumber merchant, and he provided a lot of building materials. He came down by rail or by ship, and he stuck with the project. We had an amazing number of interesting people who bought at Arundel-on-the-Bay. Detailed their biographies in my chapters, and I think they must have had a great old time. I don't want to say that there was an Irish community, but there were several Irish families. There were large families. The activities were very formal, as you read in Victorian niceties. There were chaperone dances and picnics and crab feasts and little boat trips and picnics over on Thomas's Island, and dances. They interchanged with Bay Ridge. At the time, Bay Ridge was the resort, main resort of the Chesapeake Bay. So our people went there and had parties. People came from there to have parties with us. that was part of our early life, and I'll pass it on now so that we can talk about how we got from here and there.
In 1890, when Arundel-on-the-Bay was started, they had a transportation problem. Like automobile hadn't been invented yet, so they didn't have any streets. So you could come from Washington by horse and buggy if you chose. But fortunately, the rail system in Annapolis at the time was really nice. There was a railroad that came from Washington. There was a railroad that came from Baltimore. There was even one that went across the Chesapeake Bay by ferry over to Bay City. And the focal point was Bay Ridge. So all the developers of Thomas Point had to do was to build a railroad from Bay Ridge to Arundel-on-the-Bay to get people there, and that's what they did. They built the Arundel-on-the-Bay Railroad, or in the Hall of Records, it's actually the Chesapeake and Columbia Street Railway in the Railway Historical Records. It was only a few miles, and but it provided excellent way for customers to get there. And it was alleged to run every hour on the hour in the summertime. And today, of course, none of those rail lines exist. However, the remnants of the Arundel-on-the-Bay Railroad are in the bay off the end of Magnolia Avenue, if you want to go check them out. And there are pieces, at least one piece of the Bay Ridge Railroad still exists. It's in the driveway on Farragut Avenue, if you want to go look at it. If you'd like to check out the remainder of the rail, you can go into your own parking lot behind the archives. And if you start south toward the creek, you will find the switch where you had a choice to go to Baltimore or Washington. But anyway, it's right there in the back of the parking lot if you want to see the remnant rails of Annapolis.
The difference in chapter 4 is we're now at 1898, and at that point, Arundel-on-the-Bay became a town through an enactment from Maryland legislature, and this began some funds coming from roads and such. So this is the map of Arundel-on-the-Bay. That is the 1904 map, U.S. Geological Service, and you see the dots are the few houses that we had. The rail coming from Bay Ridge would come down here. The turnaround was somewhere there. And we think also that we had a couple of small guest houses, hotels. They were advertised in the paper. I wasn't able to find a whole lot about it, but we had 4 different names for small hotels. The founders wanted to build a large hotel. They envisioned 500 rooms, but that didn't come to pass. This is actually in a cottage currently at Arundel-on-the-Bay, hunting rifle. Hunting was in and out of favor. There was the Thomas Point Gunning Club, Arundel Gun Club. At least one of our people were members. There were some periods where hunting wasn't considered the right thing to do, but this is currently in, and I only discovered it a year ago, last fall, that I found this rifle in someone's house. Many people have wondered why it took us so long to write our book. It took us 7 years to glue. But one of the values of taking this time is you discover things that you wouldn't have found right away. The owner has said that I'm not to tell anybody whose house this is. Now this again is Louise, and her Louise Seeley, who was our great source, in the middle there, and her mother, Mabel Kent, and her aunt on their porch. Now the house that her family had was out on the point, and it was like a considerably major house and had a series of interesting owners. Built in 1895. The original house no longer exists, though, but this is the porch of that house. And it was owned by Representative Payson was a congressman from Illinois. He had Abraham Lincoln's district, and he bought the guild down here. Well, the big event in my period of history was in April of 1916. All this lovely Adirondack coastline, most of it was lost to housing because there was a fire. And this shows in the red dots, if you could see, these were houses that were destroyed. Essentially, at least 2/3 of what was here. We think there were about 35, 36 cottages and some community facilities. One afternoon, from the farm, there was a farm that was leased to someone by the community. So the fire started on the farm and the wind blew it around in such a way that it was impossible to stop. So it was a shock. At the time, as we see in the newspaper articles about Arundel-on-the-Bay, the cottages all have very fun names. So I've used them here on the chart: Rose Cottage, Concord Cottage, and such. We had a post office established in 1904, maybe earlier, and our neighbors from the north at Highland Beach would come down and get their mail at our post office. We also had something called the Chain and Sprocket Club. Whoops, sorry. Chain and Sprocket was a bicycle club, a riders club established at Western High School in 1898. And we had an outpost, and they had a cottage down here. Bike riding was great fun, and they had various events, even given the state of roads, but it was a very popular thing at the time. After the fire, they got together very quickly at the Old Abbott Grill in Washington, D.C. They had their meetings to discuss how they were going to rebuild, and some land transfers occurred, and things moved right along to rebuild. But this obviously changed the landscape for Arundel-on-the-Bay.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Neal, and I grew up summers at Arundel-on-the-Bay in the 50s and 60s. And I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to talk to you about the sources that correlate to the pictures that will be shown. So this just gives you a quick overview, the fact that we were the smallest incorporated town in the United States. And I'll talk about conditions and restrictions for people of color, some of the changes in our land, and the fact that we were the first part of Maryland where women were allowed to vote after 1920, and many impactful real estate maneuvers. I'll mention one in particular and show you a picture of some of the children who grew up in the town. Starting out with Elijah Wells. He was a retired Lieutenant Navy captain who was the only citizen, only resident, who lived in Arundel-on-the-Bay year-round. And he became known as the one. And yet, he called all the other people who came down during the summers out-of-towners. Because they were not part of the census. When the census took place, it was just he. And that's supposedly. When you read the book, you'll find that there actually were some other people, but the point is that Elijah Wells was famous, and I was so excited when I found a photo of him at the Enoch Pratt Library in their Maryland room in Baltimore. So he really, really existed. Okay, the next is a copy of an ad that was in the Baltimore Sun, and it reflects the times. As you can see, the restriction in terms of white only, it being welcome at the auction, and it actually reflected language that appeared in the deeds for the various tracts that were sold and the individual deeds, and it read, "Said lot of land should not be sold, leased, or transferred to, or occupied by any person of African, Asiatic, or Mongolian blood or descent." And we found this, of course, in the Kiplinger collection in the Washington Historical Society, and also located in Maryland Land Records. So we have a lot to, we owe a lot to the archives for that. This is a photo of Dr. Dr. Austin Maurice Curtis. And interestingly, all during the 1920s and 30s and so forth, actually he lived until 38, but he and his 3 sons, who were also doctors, lived in the northeast part of the developed part of Arundel-on-the-Bay. Now you can say, how could that be if there was such a restriction? But in fact, there were African Americans who had purchased land back to Pam's chapter, as a matter of fact. The wife of the son of Frederick Douglass actually had purchased land. You'll see about all that, and she and others. And in fact, she was the one who sold the property to Dr. Curtis in 1916. And I point this photo up because it's kind of interesting that people south of the northeast part would come up, bring their children up if they'd broken an arm, that kind of thing, because there was almost always a doctor in the house in the summer. But the Curtises and others, as the story goes, never ventured south. This photo was via the internet. The next is a photo of, here again, this is Louise Lincoln with her brother Bill, and on the far left is Wes Harris, and his son William is here on the far right. And I put this photo up because I thought it was good for you to see that even though there were those restrictions, of course people interacted. The Harrises actually provided services for the Lincoln's family. But there's another photo where you actually show where he's showing Bill and Louise how to install pilings for the family pier. So people did interact, and this is important as you see things begin to evolve during this period of time between the world wars. Erosion. This is the result of the hurricane of 1933, and the waterfront at Arundel-on-the-Bay. If you've ever been there, you know there's. I'm 12 feet above sea level, but and as Pam mentioned, we're far back. In fact, her house, which is to the right of mine, was at one time 100 feet farther out, and therefore where the bay is now. So can you imagine after the hurricane when people saw how their waterfront had broken off in effect? And I want to mention some other break-offs, if I may. The point, the very tip. I think Pam also mentioned that broke away, and it became what the children there called First Island and Second Island. They actually have a picture of them on a fort on one of them. And also Thomas Point, if you're familiar with that part, near Arundel-on-the-Bay, on the other side of Fishing Creek, the tip there broke off, and that became Thomas Island. Well, over time, all of those islands have become submerged. In fact, there's actually an area where it's hazardous. You have to go around it because it's probably the surface of what's left of Thomas Island, right? Okay. I want to mention, before I talk about the children here, I want to mention there was one other find that was the most exciting to me of all. And I don't know if you know about Oyster Harbor, which is our neighboring community, but at one time, Oyster Harbor and Arundel-on-the-Bay was all one, Arundel-on-the-Bay. It was one big tract. But in 1941, the Meredith family actually sold away all of the Oyster Harbor tract to a corporation called Forest Beach. So that's how Arundel-on-the-Bay shrank, and it's that I learned through the Anne Arundel Circuit Court land records. And also, by spending a lot of time here, I'm so thankful for the assistance that I got when I came here. I learned how to use the Maryland land records even at home. And I think it was 2 o'clock one morning when I discovered this, and I was just elated. These are children on the beach, but the significance is they're from neighborhoods all around the peninsula, and it was just delightful. One of our book signings recently, there was a woman who, after she bought the book, was looking through and said, "Oh my goodness, I am so glad I came and bought this book. There are two of my cousins among these young men. So, finally, I just want to say, it was the town records, it was the, land records, also up at the Historical Society. It was here, as I said, it was the census, it was legislation that's been passed that tells us about how our incorporated town became disincorporated, and also photos from Tom Worthington, who we talked about, and from Louise Lincoln's Besdick Sealy. And what I would encourage all of you, if you are thinking about doing your family history, don't wait.
Good afternoon. I'm Aris Allen, and I was co-author of Chapter 6 along with Aaron Thomas, who was unable to attend today. And our chapter also deals with the 50s, the 1950s, and the 1960s. I guess I have the unique pleasure of living, was pretty much spending my whole life at Arundel-on-the-Bay. So I grew up there, and I've seen changes to the community, and a particular incident that occurred in Arundel-on-the-Bay was related to a piece of real estate. And there was a disagreement between two families over this real estate. It was this house that created the disagreement. And the person or the property owner that built this house did it at the objection of families that lived across the street, because they felt that when they built this house, it would block their water view, which is often the case even today. Folks are concerned when a house is built on the water. And so when the family, or as the family built the house, I think many of the residents expressed their disapproval. And so this family, I think, got to a point where they didn't feel welcomed in the community anymore. And so once they finished construction, I guess they really were angry, and they, I guess, wanted to get back at the community for treating them as bad as they did. So they put the house up for sale, and they felt that a way to get back at the community was to sell it to a black family. And so there's a story that says that we've heard from many, right here, that we've heard over the years, that this family actually put a sign in their front yard that said "House for sale to colored only." And so they were real clear about what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it. And the house was sold to a black doctor from Washington, D.C. And so that dispute over this one piece of real estate changed the complexion of the community. Because once this doctor, they sold it to this doctor, then of course word spread that Arundel-on-the-Bay is available, and many other black families started to buy in the community. So between, this property was sold in 1949, and so from that point on, the 50s and the 60s was a major change in the community, from pretty much all white to all black. And over time, the community is sort of equalized out now until the current time, when there's a mixture now, a pretty good mixture of races now in the community, not only blacks and white, but Hispanics and other ethnic groups. But I lived here, I grew up there, as I said, so I not only read about this, I lived this. And even though, and one thing I want to point out too, this was sort of a vacation community. People didn't live there full-time. My family was one of the few that lived there full-time. And so I went to the local schools and participated in the local events here in Annapolis. And the schools were segregated, and they gradually, they didn't desegregate the schools all at one time. They did it grade by grade. So, for instance, I was in elementary school, and I was the first integrated class, in the first integrated class as I went from one class to the next. And it was interesting. I won't get into all the details of what was involved, but there was definitely, we were not welcomed in various parts of Annapolis. And so over time, Arundel-on-the-Bay changed, and as I said, now today it's a good mixture. But I think my co-author here also, he didn't, you didn't really live there full time when you were young, right? But he eventually moved there and started his family, and now still lives there at Arundel-on-the-Bay. Thank you.
Thank you. Edie?
I'm gonna try to figure this out on my own. I'm Edie Dolberg, and I wrote the last chapter, which is 1970 through the present, with the assistance of John Moses and Wilma Cobble, neither one of them who could be here today. And during this time frame, 1970 to present, most of the research was done through community records, community memory, and newspaper articles. And this is a demonstration of what we're doing to try to keep our community from totally disappearing into the Bay. In 1982, with the assistance of the DNR and the state, we did a bulkhead reconstruction. Any kind of, and this is a picture of it, the original bulkhead, anything that was there before, was built in the 1930s by the WPA, and obviously after many, many years of being battered, erosion was definitely an issue. Unfortunately, in 2003, when we had Hurricane Isabel, the new bulkhead didn't help. Didn't help that. And here, a picture of some of the community kids who thought it was a blast walking around in the water, and some of the homes, especially close to the waterfront, down by the point, a lot of damage was done. This house, which Pam had talked about previously, is called the Payson House. That's what we were referring to it. It was built in 1895. It burned down in 1980. And apparently at that time, it was questionable as to why it actually burned down. And we go into that into the book. The home was owned by the Cobles and Wilma Cobble, one of the co-authors, and they have rebuilt the home since then. It doesn't look anything like this now, which is kind of a shame. And we are very proud to pull out a picture of Alex Haley anytime that we can. During the Kunta Kinte dedication of the monument downtown, he visited the home of Willie and Joyce McManus in the Bay. That's a picture of Alex Haley and his sister. In 1990, the community actually celebrated its 100th anniversary, or 100th birthday. had a parade. Many of the dignitaries from the state were invited, and they came down, and makes us very proud that in spite of all the ups and downs and ins and outs and changes, the community continues, and obviously life continues to go on. We've got a thriving community, and we're loving our diversity there now.
Thank you all for sharing your wonderful
Thank you.
stories.